So, hello and welcome. My name is Geoffrey Collier and I run Impress Books, a publisher of quality fiction and non-fiction, as well as iLuris Publishing, a publisher of fantasy and science fiction. Today we're talking to author Tracey Warr about her book coming out today, Conquest, the Anarchy, published by Impress Books. Tracey is a fiction and non-fiction writer. She's currently head of research for Dartington Hall Trust, where she supervises PhDs and teaches on MA Poetics of Imagination and MA Arts and Place at the Dartington Arts School. Previously, Tracey was senior lecturer and program lead in fine art at Oxford Brookes University, senior lecturer and program lead for MA Contemporary Arts and for Arts Management at Dartington College of Arts, guest professor, public art MFA at Bauhaus University Weimar, and art history tutor for St. Francis University in France and for the Open University. Her first novel, Almodus the Peace Weaver, set in 11th century France and Spain, was published in 2011 by Impress Books. It was shortlisted for the Impress Prize for New Fiction and the Rome Film Festival Book Initiative and received a Santander Research Award. Her second novel, The Viking Hostage, was set in 10th century France and Wales and was published by Impress Books in 2014 and was a bestseller on Amazon Australia history lists. Tracey was awarded a 2015 Literature Wales bursary for work on her Conquest trilogy, set in 12th century Wales, England and Normandy. So welcome, Tracey. It's great to have you here with us today.
Hello, Jeff. Thanks very much. Sorry for that long biography. That's the consequence of getting older. Doing lots of things.
Well, I'm getting older. I'm not sure I have a very long biography. So, but anyway, yes, a very long and, by the looks of things, distinguished career in the world of arts. So, we're here to talk about your Conquest series, of course. It concludes today with the launch of Conquest, the Anarchy, and we will talk about that in a bit. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about you as a writer, if that's okay. And the question that everyone asks now, the first thing that people ask is, how are you getting on in lockdown? Have you been safe and well? And all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, both good and bad in lockdown, and it's very different for everybody, isn't it? Each individual is experiencing it differently, depending on their situation. I'm lucky that I live in Devon, on the Dartington estate. It's incredibly beautiful, and I can walk around out here in the medieval deer park, and it's green and lush and fantastic. And I've been surrounded by blossoming magnolias and the like. But it's hard that my family are all in London, including my 3-year-old grandson, and I'm missing them terribly. And then I am actually working, as you mentioned, just establishing the new art school at Dartington. So I've been working more or less full time from home, so constantly on Zoom, in fact. Yeah, and then trying to get some writing and, working with you on the launch of the new novel, working around my other job.
Yeah. Okay. You stayed healthy though. That's the most important thing.
I've stayed healthy. I mean, it surprised me in lots of ways, this lockdown. I always think of myself as quite even keeled emotionally, and I've found that I've been quite volatile. I think it's being on my own, because I don't have anyone else in my household. So you lose perspective, without that contact with other people, telling you when you're talking nonsense or getting overly arrogant, whatever it is. So I feel quite emotionally volatile and surprised by that.
Yeah. Well, we'll try and not upset your emotional keel today. And hopefully we can have an enjoyable conversation. So in addition to your fiction, which we of course will talk about, you also write non-fiction and you produce artwork. So can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of your life?
Yes, well, I always thought I was going to be a novelist when I was young. I voraciously read my way through my local public library, and I wrote some very terrible things when I was about 8, like a really derivative novel and a really boring play about Rome and bad poetry. And then, you know, then I studied English literature at university, but then life takes you down different tracks. You know, the imperative to pay your rent or mortgage, you find yourself sometimes doing other things. So, you know, kind of by accident, I became an art curator and a contemporary art academic. So I was writing lots of nonfiction, writing about contemporary art. But it was quite a long time before I got back to my original, you know, intention of being a novelist in my 40s. Yeah. So I organised exhibitions, so mostly working with contemporary artists all around the world, in Madrid, in London, and then I started teaching in universities based in fine art departments, and teaching art history and theory. And it's kind of interesting for me, you know, when I started writing novels, I thought that this was something completely separate from my life as an art historian. And I struggled for a long time to, you know, find the connection and not simply feel split in two. But now I realise I'm using my art history knowledge a lot in my historical fiction writing. But also I do things like, you know, I've been installing texts as artworks. So in France, I was commissioned for an exhibition to write about the future, about exoplanets, you know, other places where that can sustain human life. And I wrote a short future fiction and then kind of inscribed it on the path by the river. So it's like with an installation.
Yeah. Interesting.
I've kind of got a foot in both camps.
Yeah.
Straddling, you know, visual art and literature.
Yeah. Excellent. I mean, some of that you've answered some questions I was going to come on to actually, but I'm interested in that you originally thought you were going to be a novelist and then life took you in a slightly different direction. What was it that prompted you to come back to novels, to fiction, to that part of your interest?
Yeah, I mentioned that I wrote a lot of non-fiction, so I published books and lots of catalogue essays and articles on contemporary artists, and I found my writing getting less and less theoretical and critical, if you like, and more what I describe as creative. And of course, it's difficult to say exactly, you know, what the differences are. And then my daughter left home, you know, grew up and left home. And it was time for a change in my life. So I took myself off to France, and I was writing children's stories for my nephew.
Oh, right, okay.
He just asked me to write these stories, and about castles around us in France. And I came across this extraordinary woman, Almodis de la Marche, who was Countess of Toulouse and Barcelona, and I got quite obsessed with her, and I decided to do an MA in creative writing, really to sort of give myself permission to write a novel about her. And I ended up doing the MA in Wales, in Marden, and I worked with a fantastic Welsh poet, Mena Elfyn, as my tutor, and I gained a lot from the other writers in the class as well. So it's been an interesting journey.
England to France to Wales. So yes, interesting traveling across this part of the world. And I mean, did you have any major writing setbacks at all during that period? Were there any times when you thought, oh dear?
Well, I think oh dear quite a lot. You know, I think even the most experienced writers, you know, doubt themselves at certain points. I guess you know, the biggest setback for me was perhaps the second novel, and that's also, I think, quite a common experience. You know, just you'd think that having done one, you'd feel quite confident that you could do the second, but for some reason, you know, I got very stuck with the second, and was, you know, it took me a long time to convince myself that I was going to be able to do another novel that, you know, that I felt was good enough. But it happened.
Yeah,
And
it
so,
did.
you know,
It did.
you learn to trust yourself, I think, when you have a track record.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And you know, at the end of the day, you write as best as you can, and then you have an editor to help you out where if there are any shortcomings. So, and actually, it might be worthwhile just talking about, you know, asking how you find working with editors, and you know, do you tend to get a lot of feedback from your editors in terms of, you know, what suggestions in terms of how to improve the story, or how do you work with that?
I really enjoy that, actually. I mean, I think that any writer needs to be a good self-critic. You need to be able to look at your first draft and think, that's got lots of things wrong with it, and this is what I have to do to change it. And then, you know, there's the second and the third and the 10th draft. But then you do also get to a point where you can't see it very clearly anymore.
Yeah.
You know, because you're so immersed in it and you've rewritten it so many times, and it's great to have somebody else's eyes on it. And I've had some great steers from my editors, you know, with my first novel, Almodus, the Peace Weaver. My editor, Richard Willis, said, "Oh, you know, your female characters are great, but your male characters are a bit weak. You need, you know, you need some hunt scenes and some maybe a bit of a battle scene here and there." And he was absolutely right. So that was great. I was able to sort of take that off and strengthen those parts of the novel. And I've had lots of experience like that with editors.
Yeah. And let's have a look. I guess, I mean, moving on, I mean, your fiction writing has all been historical fiction. It's set in the medieval period, and I'm curious to know how that came about. Is it happenstance that all of the stories you're interested in happen to be medieval, or do you deliberately look in that time period? I mean, how has that come about?
Yeah, I mean, initially it was accidental that I was living in France. I was surrounded by all these incredible castles, and the same in Wales, actually, when I went to live there too. But there was lots of evidence of the medieval period around me in the landscape. And I thought when I first started writing medieval fiction that I was running away in time, or going on holiday in time from my day job, if you like, which was more concerned with contemporary art and contemporary issues. And I did a lot of research for my first novel, you know, because I'm not a historian. I studied English literature at university, so I'm a sort of you know, autodidact. I had to teach myself about the history I'm writing about. So having done piles and piles of research for my first novel, you know, about 4 years worth, I think, that then gave me a good grounding for the rest of the novels going forward, and a fascination with the early medieval period.
Yeah.
And it's resonances and chimes now, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. So, you tell us a bit more about that. How where do you feel the messages are from that period for our own age?
Yeah. I've set myself up for that question.
You have, haven't you? Yeah.
I'm not sure I know the answer.
Maybe we'll come on to that in a bit, or maybe.
I mean, there are two things I'd say. I mean, one is, you know, that I'm focusing on women and women's voices and agency in the early medieval period.
Yeah.
because, you know, if you look at the history books, they don't appear very much.
They tend to be dominated by men, don't they?
Yeah, you have to work really hard to find, you know, the traces, even of quite, you know, even of queens. There's often very little, but there's something, and for a novelist, that's enough, actually. You know, I quite often have just one sentence that I found about a woman in a medieval chronicle, or if I'm lucky, a whole paragraph.
Yeah.
And then I can kind of use that to spin out into a novel and imagine into the gaps. So I think that's one reason. And then, you know, another thing that does fascinate me about the medieval period is its pre-industrial nature. So, you know, how people lived without electricity, without the kind of technology we have now. You know, they had technologies, and some of them we're rediscovering now in the contemporary world, you know, using water and wind power and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was, I mean, the coming back to your point about women, I think that's, one of the things I have found, I mean, the women you write about are very strong, very powerful women in the settings and time periods in which they live. But at the same time, they, you know, they were still women. They were still very feminine, you know, and that strength was a very different kind of strength to men's strength, which was much more showy and brute force based.
Yeah.
So, you know, how do you feel that plays to today? Because sometimes, I mean, you see it probably most evidently in politics, where there's started to be a bit of a backlash against it now, but women almost have to become like men to succeed in the world of politics, and that is slowly changing, I think. But I mean, I'm just wondering how you feel those two stories, you know, the story of powerful women in medieval versus powerful women in today's world, kind of match up, really, and whether there are lessons there for us.
I think that's a really interesting question, Jeff, because, you know, part of why I want to write about women in the medieval period is, you know, because women are 50% of the population, but they're nothing like 50% of the history books or the art galleries or governments now. And that's not because, you know, women aren't talented and can't do and haven't done. But it's more than that. It's, you know, it's not just that I want to fill in the gaps and do my bit to address those gaps. It's not just that I want to add women to history and stir, as someone wrote, but that I also want to think about, is there a different perspective on history? You know, that if we're looking more through women's eyes, that we might find, you know, so history and politics, it's not all about kings and wars and political competition. You know, life is also about having children, love, and caring for one another. And, you know, I'm not saying that those things are exclusively the domain of women, far from it. But I think that looking more through women's perspectives, you know, I'm trying to sort of balance that out, I suppose.
And I think one thing you do see in your writing is some of that aspect of men's lives as well, that they can be caring, and they can be loving, and they can have a lot of the feelings that everyone has. They're not just about, you know, I'm cleverer or more politically savvy or just tougher than you.
Yeah. I hope I'm getting better at writing about men. You know, as I've been progressing, I mentioned my first one that they started out a bit feeble, my male characters. And I've certainly enjoyed writing my male characters. You know, in the Conquest series, Henry I, the Norman king, the son of William the Conqueror, he's a recurring character through the 3 books. And my heroine, in fact, was his mistress, you know, really, in history. And and he's quite an interesting character. He had lots of mistresses, at least 24 illegitimate children, and he tried to put his daughter on the throne as his heir. So I don't know if that makes him a proto-feminist or what, but he was an intriguing character, and I enjoyed writing him and writing, of his obvious affection for women and interest in them at any rate.
Yes, I'm not sure what 24 Mistresses says about him, but he liked women. I mean, I think we can probably say that with confidence. He liked women.
Yes.
I mean, you've alluded to it already, but I guess, one of the constant challenges of writing historical fiction in particular is how much do we actually know about the time period and the characters in question. You said sometimes you have to work off a single line that you find in the text somewhere. And then of what we do know, how much of that do we actually keep in the story versus how much artistic license do we use? So I'm interested in how you find that balance yourself.
Yeah, I mentioned I do a lot of research, and obviously it's research about the people themselves, because all of my heroines have been, and the key characters have been real historical people, and then I may have to make up a few others, like my heroine's maid, a female troubadour in a first novel, and a rather badly behaved bard in my current novel. So there are some of the characters I do make up. Sorry, what was your question, Jeff? I forgot.
It was how do you balance the what we know about history versus the artistic creative license that you need?
Well, I guess what fascinates me is you can only find out so much through research. You can find out what people wore at that time, what the context was like, what the towns looked like, and so on. But what you don't read in the history books is people's psychology, their emotions, their motivations. Why did they do that instead of this? And so that's what I enjoy, imagining my way into in the novel. And also, you can't, although you want to create a credible medieval world, I want to. It's not, it's not authentic. I'm not writing in medieval Welsh, or
you might not find a very big audience if you did that.
You wouldn't like that much.
I'm sure it'd be fascinating, but not to very many people.
Yeah, so I drop in a few lines from a Welsh poem, for instance. So there's a bit of the authentic voice from the time in there. But I'm writing in contemporary English, and I'm writing from a contemporary perspective. And sometimes I bring in details from contemporary life as well. I have to transform them into something medieval, but it's something I've seen around me in my own life. Like in Conquest, Nest has a Norman schoolmaster who has his schoolroom is lined with a vitrine of locusts that he's studying, which rather horrifies her, and that's a real thing from my own school days, where our biology lab, we had this vitrine of locusts, and it was interesting. It was soundproof, so you only, when the lid was lifted to feed them, this incredible cacophony of chirping came out.
Well, I guess that's either fascinating or a bit creepy. I'm not sure. Probably depends where you are on that.
Both.
I thought it was a bit creepy, I must admit, when I read it in Daughter of the Last King. But there we go. I'm sure there are others who would love to have something similar. Maybe it's inspired a listener somewhere to go and create their own collection of locusts. I don't know. Anyway, I mean, so let's go on specifically to talk a little bit about the Conquest series. And Nest, I mean, she occupies not just an important period of time in British history, but especially in Welsh history, actually, as the title of the first book, Conquest, Daughter of the Last King. You know, it's at the end of the Welsh monarchy, really, or monarchies, I guess you might say. And it's a fascinating time period. So tell us a little bit more about her as a character, and why you wanted to tell her story.
Yeah, well, she was the daughter of what was described the last Welsh king. He was the last independent Welsh king, you know, who wasn't a client king to the Normans, who'd invaded in England and then were working on trying to conquer Wales. And whereas they conquered England in one day at the Battle of Hastings, it took them over 100 years to subdue Wales, you know, partly because there were various monarchies. There were at least 4 or 5 kings. And also, I think because of the terrain, you know, it was mountainous, forested, boggy terrain with, you know, some terrible weather. Speaking as someone who's lived there, some lovely weather.
Apologies to any Welsh who are listening to this. You have a beautiful country.
Absolutely beautiful. I lived there for many years.
Yeah,
I'd love to live there again. And the Welsh warriors also, you know, used guerrilla tactics that flummoxed the Normans, who were used to a different kind of system of battle. So they were, you know, like guerrilla warriors, the Welsh, and so they managed to keep, you know, the Normans gradually gained more and more of Welsh territory, including Nest's father's territory. So in the novels, her youngest brother, 3 of her brothers were massacred by the Normans, and her father. But her youngest brother survived and grew up in Ireland, and then came back and tried to challenge the Normans for his kingdom. He didn't have a lot. He had some success and some failure, but then his sons and Nest's nephews really did regain the kingdom. So, you know, kept the Normans at bay for another 100 years, really. But I didn't want to make the novel, you know, it is about this conflict between the Normans and the Welsh. But one of the things I'm trying to show through my heroine, her story, is that you can't simply see things, you know, as one nation pitted against another, because very quickly, you know, there was intermarriage, there was intercultural exchange. Nest's children were Cambro Normans, and it's, you know, it makes me a bit mad when people talk now about, you know, being one nation, talk about a singular sort of national identity, because it really is quite a nonsense, and it was a nonsense in the 12th century. You know, the Normans and the Welsh had both had lots of Viking DNA mixed in with theirs.
Yes, of course they did. Yeah.
And lots of other waves of invaders before that. You know, and that's even more, we're even more hybridized now.
I think there's been a bit more intermarriage in the succeeding 800 years, hasn't there? 900 years.
Bit,
yeah.
Another thing, you asked me about Nest, Jeff, and another thing, you mentioned that I've been dealing with strong women, and that was the case in my first 2 novels. And then when I got to Nest, I was fascinated by her, as many people have been, because she had this extraordinarily colourful sexual career. You know, she was the mistress of the Norman king, then castle, and when he died, she was married to the Norman constable of Cardigan Castle. She was kidnapped. She was kidnapped by her from her first husband by the Welsh prince Owen ap Cadwagan, and she possibly was the mistress of the sheriff of Pembroke, who was a Fleming named Haight. So it's an extraordinary career, and some historians have made it sound like, you know, she was promiscuous. Others looked at her as a victim. And, you know, I wanted to try and find a route through that, think about how these extraordinary things had happened to her and how she coped with them. So it was a bit of a challenge for me actually at first, because I looked at her story and thought, well, surely she was a victim. So I was trying to find, you know, how was she resilient? How did she have any power or agency in this situation?
Well, I think that shows through, but hopefully our readers do as well. And I guess actually, you know, this time has flown by, and we're probably about the point where we need to finish. But I guess I'd like to finish off just asking whether there are any particular, apart from enjoying the story, is there anything in particular you'd like readers to take away from your Conquest series as they finish it with the Anarchy?
Yeah, maybe, you know, think about those spectacular Welsh landscapes, which did inspire me in the first place. You know, Pembrokeshire, Carmarthenshire, Cardiganshire, they really are spectacular with their castles and their coastlines. If you don't know them, go and have a look at them when you can. And then, yeah, the Welsh literary tradition was also an inspiration. You know, the Mabinogion medieval stories and the Welsh bards. So I very much enjoy that part of the research that I do for writing fiction.
Good. Well, thank you very much. If we had more time, we could talk about your bards and troubadours and what have you, but I don't think we probably do for now. So thank you so much for your time, Tracey. All the best for the release of The Anarchy. And thank you to our listeners. So we hope you've been inspired by Tracey. And if you'd like to have a look at her Conquest series, the first 2 books, Daughter of the Last King and The Drowned Court, are available as paperbacks and ebooks from all good retailers in the UK. The Anarchy ebook is available now on all the main platforms, retailers, and the paperback will be available within the next month or so. The ebooks of all of the series are also available in the US, Australia, and Canada. So stay safe, everyone, and happy reading.